Right now, as you listen to these words, there are 500 people who are legally dead. Their hearts stopped beating years ago, some decades ago, and yet they might be the only ones among us who will see the 22nd century. They rest in steel cylinders filled with liquid nitrogen at minus 196 degrees Celsius, waiting for a future that may never come, or waiting for the moment when death itself becomes optional. Before we start, a quick roll call. Write in the comments which part of this planet you're watching from, and then just listen and enjoy. The question we're exploring today isn't really about technology or science, though we'll discuss plenty of both. The question is deeper and older than any laboratory. What are you willing to risk for the possibility of more time? Not just more years, but potentially infinite years. What would you pay? What would you sacrifice? What would you endure to keep the door open just a crack, to hold on to the thread of existence when everyone around you lets it go? 500 frozen bodies, 500 gambles, 500 acts of either profound hope or profound denial, depending on who you ask. By the end of this journey, you'll understand how we arrived at this strange moment in human history. What actually happens when you try to preserve a human being at temperatures that would shatter steel, and perhaps most importantly, what this tells us about ourselves, about our relationship with the one certainty that binds every living thing. Let me take you back to January 12th, 1967. A small house in Glendale, California. Inside, a 73-year-old psychology professor named James Hiram Bedford lay dying of kidney cancer. His son was by his side, along with a small team of people who had never done what they were about to attempt. They had read the theories, studied the proposals, built the equipment in garages and basements. But theory is always cleaner than reality, and reality was coming fast. When Bedford's heart stopped, the team moved with practiced urgency that masked their terror. They began chest compressions immediately, not to bring him back, but to keep oxygen flowing to his brain. They packed his body in ice. They injected his bloodstream with chemicals designed to protect his cells from the destruction that freezing usually brings. And then, over the next several days, they slowly, carefully lowered his body temperature degree by degree until he reached that magical, terrible number, minus 196 degrees Celsius, the temperature of liquid nitrogen, the temperature at which molecular movement almost stops, the temperature of suspended animation. Bedford became patient 1, the first human being to undergo cryonic preservation with the explicit intention of eventual revival. He wasn't the first person to die believing in this possibility. He was simply the first whose family had the resources, the connections, and the strange courage to actually do it. And here's what makes this story even more remarkable. James Bedford is still frozen. Right now. 58 years later. His body rests in a facility in Arizona, patient number A1045, transferred and maintained through decades, through the rise and fall of cryonics organizations, through technological improvements and social ridicule. He has outlasted, in a sense, many people who were alive and healthy when he died. His preservation has cost more in electricity and maintenance than most people earn in a lifetime, and no one knows if it means anything at all. But Bedford wasn't alone for long. Others followed, slowly at first, then steadily. By the 1970s, dozens had been frozen. By the 80s, over 100. Today, that number has reached 500, with thousands more signed up and waiting for their turn. These aren't just elderly people at death's door. Some are children who died of rare diseases. Some are middle-aged optimists who want to see what comes next. Some are couples who arrange to be frozen together, unwilling to let death separate them even temporarily. And yes, some are eccentric millionaires, but most are ordinary people who saved for years or took out life insurance policies with their cryonics organization as the beneficiary. They come from different countries, different cultures, different philosophies. What unites them is a single radical proposition: that death, as we currently understand it, might not be permanent. That the line between life and death might be blurrier than we think. That what we call dead might really mean beyond current medical intervention, but not beyond future medical intervention. It's the difference between a broken computer and a destroyed computer. One might be fixable with better tools. The other is gone forever. This idea violates something deep in the human psyche. We are storytelling creatures, and every story needs an ending. Death provides that ending. It gives life meaning through scarcity. It allows us to mourn and move forward. It maintains the natural order. To suggest that death might be reversible feels almost obscene, like claiming you can unbreak an egg or unburn a book. It feels like hubris, like humanity reaching too far, playing God in the most literal sense possible. And yet, we do this all the time. Every time a heart stops on an operating table and doctors restart it, we're reversing death, at least according to older definitions. Every time someone drowns in cold water and is revived 90 minutes later with no brain damage, we're pushing the boundary further. Legally dead, clinically dead, biologically dead, brain dead. These categories exist because the line keeps moving. What was irreversible yesterday becomes routine tomorrow. The question isn't whether we should fight death. We've been doing that since the first human used medicine or fire or shelter. The question is how far we can push before we're not fighting death, but simply denying it. The people who choose cryonics aren't denying that they died. They died. Hearts stopped. Brains went silent. Legal death certificates were signed. What they're betting on is that dead and permanently dead might not be the same thing. If you can preserve the structure that makes you you, if you can protect the intricate dance of neurons and synapses that somehow produces consciousness, memory, personality, love, fear, hope, everything that makes a person, then maybe, just maybe, a sufficiently advanced future could rebuild what was lost. It's a long shot. Everyone involved admits this. The cryonics organizations themselves will tell you they cannot guarantee success. They cannot even guarantee that success is possible. What they can do is preserve you in the best condition current technology allows and hope that future technology is better. Much, much better. Better enough to repair damage at the molecular level, to rebuild cells that were destroyed by ice crystals, to restore connections between neurons that were severed by death and freezing and decades of storage. Better enough to solve problems we don't even fully understand yet. And this is where it gets philosophically strange, because the people in those cylinders, they're not waiting for a miracle. They're waiting for engineering. They're betting that consciousness and identity emerge from physical structure, that there's no ghost in the machine, just the machine. And if you preserve the machine well enough and fix it carefully enough, the ghost returns on its own because it was never separate to begin with. It's a thoroughly materialist vision of human existence. We are meat that thinks. Complex meat, beautiful meat, meat capable of love and art and philosophy, but meat nonetheless. And meat, in theory, can be repaired. Over the next sections, we'll explore how we got here, how a fringe idea from science fiction became a real industry with real facilities and real bodies in real cylinders. We'll look at the science, both the genuine achievements and the enormous unsolved problems. We'll meet the people who made this choice and try to understand what drove them. We'll examine the economics, the ethics, the hope, and the delusion that dance around each other in this strange space between life and death. We'll visit the facilities where these bodies are kept, walk among the cylinders, feel the cold radiating off steel dewars that hold 4 or 5 or 6 people each, stacked head down in liquid nitrogen like some macabre filing system for human possibility. We'll talk to the technicians who monitor them, the scientists who criticize the whole enterprise, and the family members left behind, waiting for a reunion that may never come or may come in a world they cannot imagine. Because ultimately, this isn't a story about technology. It's a story about us, about what we value, what we fear, what we're willing to believe when faced with the one thing that has defeated every human who ever lived. 500 people made a choice that most of us would never make. They looked at death and said, "Not yet, not forever, not if I can help it." Whether they were brave or foolish, visionary or deluded, we won't know for a very long time. But their choice forces us to ask our own questions. What would you do with 1,000 more years? Would you want them? Would you trust a future you cannot see to honor your frozen sleep? Would you want to wake up in a world where everyone you loved is gone? Where your language might be archaic? Where you are a refugee from the past? Or would you rather let go when your time comes? Trust in the natural cycle? Find peace in the ending? There are no right answers here, only choices. And 500 people have already made theirs, suspended between one world and another, between life and death, between now and someday, waiting in the cold and the dark for a dawn that may never break. Let's begin. The idea of freezing the dead didn't begin in a laboratory. It began in the pages of stories, in the fevered imaginings of writers who looked at death and asked the same question humans have always asked: what if we could cheat it? Long before anyone actually attempted cryonic preservation, the concept existed in folklore and fiction. Ancient myths spoke of heroes who slept for centuries in caves or under spells, waiting for the moment their people needed them again. Sleeping Beauty, Rip Van Winkle, King Arthur, resting in Avalon until Britain's darkest hour. These weren't stories about death. They were stories about pause buttons, about skipping forward through time while remaining fundamentally unchanged. The dream is older than history itself, but the modern version, the scientific version, began to take shape in the early 20th century. In 1931, a science fiction writer named Neil Jones published a short story called The Jameson Satellite. In it, a professor arranges to have his body launched into orbit after death, where the cold of space would preserve him indefinitely. Millions of years later, he's discovered by machine men who revive his brain and give him a new mechanical body. It's pulp fiction, melodramatic and strange, but buried in that strange tale was a seed of an idea. Extreme cold preserves. Time doesn't destroy what temperature protects. Around the same time, actual scientists were beginning to experiment with the effects of cold on living tissue. They discovered something remarkable. Certain cells, certain simple organisms, could survive freezing if you did it carefully enough. Sperm cells could be frozen and revived. Some bacteria could withstand incredibly low temperatures. There were even fish in Antarctic waters that produced natural antifreeze in their blood, allowing them to survive in waters cold enough to kill other species instantly. But there's a vast difference between freezing a single cell and freezing a human being. Cells are simple. Humans are catastrophically complex. We're made of trillions of cells organized into intricate systems, each dependent on the others, each vulnerable to damage in unique ways. When water freezes, it expands. Ice crystals form sharp edges that puncture cell membranes like tiny knives. Blood vessels rupture, organs distort. The very act of preservation destroys what you're trying to save. Every cryobiologist knew this. Freezing a human solid would turn their tissues into something resembling shattered glass. That should have been the end of it. An interesting idea defeated by basic physics and chemistry. But then came Robert Ettinger. Ettinger was a physics teacher from Michigan, a World War II veteran who had been badly wounded in combat and spent months in hospitals thinking about mortality. He was a science fiction reader, like many scientifically minded people of his generation, and he couldn't let go of the idea that freezing might work if you could just solve the ice crystal problem. He wasn't a doctor. He wasn't a biologist. He was a teacher with an obsession and a typewriter. In 1962, Ettinger published a book called The Prospect of Immortality. It wasn't fiction. It was a serious, carefully reasoned argument for why cryonic preservation should be attempted immediately, despite the unsolved problems, despite the skepticism, despite everything. His logic was simple, and in its way, undeniable. If you bury or cremate a body, that person is definitely gone forever. Zero chance of revival. But if you freeze that body in the best possible condition, using whatever methods are currently available, then maybe, possibly, potentially, a more advanced future could repair the damage. The probability might be low, might be incredibly low, but it's not zero. And something greater than zero is infinitely better than zero. This is what philosophers call Pascal's wager applied to death itself. You have nothing to lose by trying, because the alternative is certain oblivion. Even a 1% chance, even a 0.1% chance is worth taking if the stakes are your entire existence. Ettinger argued that within decades or centuries, nanotechnology would advance to the point where molecular machines could repair damage cell by cell, atom by atom. Future medicine wouldn't need to cure your disease or restart your heart. It would need to rebuild you from the preserved structure up. The book found its audience. Not a huge audience, but a passionate one. Scientists, engineers, mathematicians, science fiction enthusiasts, people comfortable with probabilistic thinking and long-term gambles. They formed organizations: the Cryonics Society of California, the Cryonics Society of New York, the Cryonics Society of Michigan. They weren't wealthy. They didn't have institutional support. They were amateurs trying to solve problems that professional scientists had dismissed as impossible. They experimented with freezing techniques in their garages. They designed storage vessels. They wrote legal documents trying to figure out how to freeze someone without being charged with murder or desecration of a corpse. And they waited for their first volunteer. The cultural moment mattered enormously. The 1960s were intoxicated with technological optimism. Humans had split the atom, invented computers, and were racing to the moon. Medical science had conquered polio, developed antibiotics, achieved the first successful organ transplants. Every month brought new miracles. The future felt inevitable and glorious. If we could reach the moon, why couldn't we defeat death? It seemed like a simple engineering problem, waiting for the right tools. There was also a particular American flavor to the movement. The idea that death was just another frontier to conquer, that individual willpower and technological innovation could overcome any obstacle, that you didn't need to accept limits imposed by nature or tradition. Cryonics embodied a kind of radical individualism. You didn't have to accept the death sentence that every previous generation had accepted. You could fight back. You could refuse. But enthusiasm and theory only carry you so far. They still needed to actually freeze someone. And that's where things got complicated. The first attempts were disasters. In 1965, a woman in California wanted to be frozen after death, but the attempt was hasty and disorganized. Her body wasn't properly preserved. It was stored inadequately. Eventually, her relatives lost faith in the process and had her buried. There were other failed attempts. Bodies frozen and then thawed when money ran out, or organizations collapsed. These early failures were kept quiet, but they revealed a harsh truth. Wanting to freeze people and actually maintaining them indefinitely were two completely different challenges. Then came James Bedford in January of 1967. His freezing wasn't perfect. The techniques were primitive. The team made mistakes. But Bedford's family was committed, and more importantly, they had resources. His son understood that this would be a long-term project requiring long-term funding. They arranged for Bedford's body to be transferred between organizations as some failed and others emerged. They paid for improvements to his storage. They treated it not as a one-time procedure, but as an ongoing commitment across decades. Bedford's successful long-term preservation changed everything. It proved the concept could work logistically, even if no one knew whether it could work medically. Other freezings followed, each one slightly better than the last as techniques improved. Organizations learned from their mistakes. They developed better perfusion methods, better cryoprotectants, better storage systems. The science was still speculative, but the practice was becoming real. By the 1970s, cryonics was no longer just theory. It was an actual industry, small and strange and controversial, but undeniably real. And it attracted exactly the kind of people you'd expect: futurists, transhumanists, life extension enthusiasts, technologists who believed that mortality was a solvable problem rather than an existential fact. These were people who looked at death not with acceptance or spirituality, but with frustration, even anger. Why should consciousness end? Why should accumulated wisdom vanish? Why should love be temporary? If the universe allows consciousness to emerge from matter, why shouldn't we fight to preserve it? This was the philosophical foundation, not a fear of death exactly, but a rejection of death's inevitability. A belief that surrendering to mortality wasn't noble or wise, but simply premature, giving up before trying every possible option. They saw themselves not as death deniers, but as death deferrers, buying time until better solutions emerged. And so, the cylinders began to fill, slowly. One body, then another, then another. Each one a bet placed on a future no one could guarantee. Each one a story of hope or desperation, or simple stubborn refusal to accept the unacceptable. The strange science of cheating death had moved from the pages of pulp magazines into steel containers filled with liquid nitrogen. 500 people now rest in that cold, and every single one of them traces back to that moment when someone asked, "What if?" and refused to accept "impossible" as an answer. The question is whether they were right to try. Let's talk about what actually happens when you try to freeze a human being. Not the philosophy, not the hope, but the cold physics and chemistry of taking a body from 37 degrees Celsius down to minus 196. Because this is where theory meets the brutal reality of biology, and where the entire premise of cryonics either stands or collapses. Minus 196 degrees Celsius. That's the boiling point of liquid nitrogen, the temperature at which nitrogen shifts from liquid to gas under normal atmospheric pressure. It's unimaginably cold. At this temperature, biological processes don't just slow down, they essentially stop. Chemical reactions that power life require molecular movement, and at minus 196, molecules barely move at all. Bacteria can't grow. Enzymes can't function. Decay cannot proceed. In theory, a body stored at this temperature could remain unchanged for centuries, for millennia, frozen in the exact state it entered. In theory. The problem is ice, specifically what ice does to living tissue. When water freezes normally, it expands by about 9%. That expansion is destructive enough when it bursts your water pipes in winter. Inside a human body, it's catastrophic. Cells are mostly water. When that water freezes and expands, it ruptures cell membranes from the inside. Ice crystals form sharp, jagged structures that slice through delicate cellular machinery. Blood vessels tear. Organs distort and crack. The intricate architecture that makes a liver, a kidney, a brain, gets shredded at the microscopic level. And the brain is what matters most. You could theoretically replace every organ in the body with artificial versions or transplants. The heart, the lungs, the kidneys, these are important, but ultimately replaceable. The brain is different. The brain is you. Your memories, your personality, your sense of self, everything that makes you an individual, rather than just a human-shaped organism, resides in the approximately 86 billion neurons in your brain and the trillions of connections between them. If those connections are destroyed, if the precise pattern of synapses is lost, then it doesn't matter if future medicine can repair the tissue. You're gone. The structure that encoded your identity no longer exists. This is the fundamental challenge of cryonics. Not just preserving tissue, but preserving information. The pattern matters more than the material. Think of it like a book. If water damage makes some words unreadable, that's unfortunate, but you can still get most of the story. If the pages are shredded and scattered, even if you collect every fiber, you cannot reassemble the original text. The information is lost, even though the physical material remains. The question cryonics must answer is this: does freezing preserve enough of the brain's structural information to potentially reconstruct identity, or does it shred the pages beyond recovery? The early cryonics pioneers understood this problem. They knew that simply freezing a body solid would cause massive damage. So they looked for solutions, and they found one in an unexpected place: the study of how to preserve organs for transplantation. Medical researchers working on organ preservation had discovered something crucial. If you replace the water in tissue with certain chemicals before freezing, you can minimize ice crystal formation. These chemicals are called cryoprotectants, and they work like antifreeze for cells. The most common cryoprotectants are glycerol, dimethyl sulfoxide, and ethylene glycol. Yes, the same basic compounds used in car antifreeze, though obviously pharmaceutical-grade versions. These substances have a special property. They lower the freezing point of water, and more importantly, they allow tissue to cool to extremely low temperatures without forming large, destructive ice crystals. Instead of freezing, the tissue vitrifies. It turns into a glass-like state, solid, but without the crystalline structure that causes damage. Vitrification is the holy grail of cryonics. If you can vitrify tissue perfectly, with no ice formation at all, then in theory, the structure is preserved completely. Every cell membrane intact, every synapse unchanged, every protein in its proper configuration. The tissue isn't frozen, it's paused, locked into a glassy solid state that maintains its microscopic architecture. Thaw it properly, remove the cryoprotectants, and theoretically, you'd have undamaged tissue. But there's a massive gap between theory and practice. Vitrifying a small piece of tissue is possible. Scientists have successfully vitrified and rewarmed rabbit kidneys with some functionality preserved. They've vitrified and revived simple organisms like nematode worms. But a human brain weighs about 1.4 kilograms. It's encased in a skull. It has an incredibly complex blood vessel network. Getting cryoprotectants distributed evenly throughout the entire brain at concentrations high enough to prevent ice formation, but low enough not to cause toxic damage, while cooling fast enough to prevent ice from forming, but slow enough to allow the chemicals to penetrate, is extraordinarily difficult. This is why cryonics organizations focus so heavily on the perfusion process. Perfusion means replacing the blood and other fluids in the body with cryoprotectant solution, using the body's own circulatory system as a distribution network. As soon as legal death is declared, the team begins. They restart circulation artificially, using a mechanical heart-lung device to push oxygenated blood through the body. This keeps the brain alive in a limited sense, buying time, preventing the immediate decay that begins within minutes of circulation stopping. Then they begin cooling and simultaneously start replacing blood with cryoprotectant solution. It's pumped in through the circulatory system while blood is drained out. The concentration gradually increases over hours. Too fast, and the osmotic shock damages cells. Too slow, and ice begins forming. The whole process is a race against chemistry, trying to get protective chemicals into every capillary, every tiny blood vessel in the brain, before ice crystals begin their destructive work, even under ideal conditions, with a team standing by at the moment of death, with perfect perfusion, with the best cryoprotectants. There's still damage. The cryoprotectants themselves are toxic at high concentrations. They have to be, to prevent freezing. The osmotic stress of replacing cellular water with chemicals causes some cells to shrink and distort. And there are always areas, particularly in the brain's deepest structures, where perfusion isn't perfect, where some ice formation occurs despite best efforts. Then there's the cooling itself. Once perfusion is complete, the body is cooled over several days down to minus 196 degrees Celsius. This has to be done gradually. Cool too quickly, and thermal stress causes cracking. The body doesn't crack like glass, but tissues can fracture at boundaries between different types of material. The brain, suspended in its skull, surrounded by cerebrospinal fluid, is particularly vulnerable. Some cryonics organizations have reported hearing audible cracking sounds during cooling, fractures forming in the vitrified tissue. These might be minor, superficial cracks, or they might sever important structures. No one knows for certain. And here's the thing that cryonics advocates are honest about, the good ones at least. Every person currently in cryonic preservation sustained damage, significant damage. The moment blood stops flowing to the brain, damage begins. Cells start dying, structures start degrading. Then there's the damage from perfusion, from cryoprotectants, from cooling, from decades of storage. The question isn't whether there's damage. The question is whether the damage destroys information or merely requires repair. Imagine a photograph that's been water damaged and torn. The image is degraded, but still recognizable. With enough skill and the right tools, you could restore it, fill in the missing pieces, recreate the original. Now imagine that same photograph put through a shredder and burned. The information is gone. No amount of skill can reconstruct the original because the pattern no longer exists, even implicitly. Cryonics is betting that current preservation techniques produce the first scenario, not the second. That even with damage, even with imperfect vitrification, even with decades of storage, the fundamental structural information that encodes personality and memory remains embedded in the tissue. That a sufficiently advanced technology, molecular nanotechnology perhaps, could examine the preserved brain at the cellular level, identify damaged structures, and repair them based on biological principles and remaining information. It's worth noting that nature provides some encouraging examples. There are organisms that survive conditions we'd consider absolutely lethal. Tardigrades, microscopic animals also called water bears, can survive being frozen to near absolute zero. They dehydrate themselves, replacing water with protective sugars, and enter a state called cryptobiosis, where metabolic activity drops to undetectable levels. Decades later, add water, and they come back to life. Certain frogs and turtles survive winter by allowing up to 70% of their body water to freeze, their hearts stopping for months, and then thaw and revive in spring. Their cells produce special proteins and sugars that protect against freezing damage. These organisms prove that the boundary between life and death isn't absolute. That biological systems can endure conditions that seem incompatible with life and return. But they also prove something else. These organisms have evolved specific mechanisms for surviving freezing. Humans haven't. We're tropical apes. Our cells don't produce natural cryoprotectants. We didn't evolve to shut down and restart. Cryonics is trying to artificially create a survival mechanism that took millions of years of evolution to develop in other species, and trying to do it with chemistry and engineering rather than biological adaptation. The critics of cryonics, and there are many in the scientific community, focus on this point. They argue that the damage is too extensive, too chaotic, too random to ever be repaired. That ice formation, even minimal ice formation, destroys the precise synaptic connections that encode memory and personality. That expecting future technology to repair this damage is like expecting future archaeologists to perfectly reconstruct a vase from a pile of dust. Yes, the atoms are all there, but the information about how they were arranged is lost. The defenders argue differently. They point out that brains aren't vases. The information isn't stored in precise atomic positions, but in larger structures, in the shapes of neurons, the patterns of connections, the distributions of proteins. Some degradation can occur without losing the essential pattern. just as you can still recognize a face in a blurry photograph. They cite studies showing that even in poorly preserved brain tissue, much of the connectome, the map of neural connections, remains visible under electron microscopy. The structures are damaged, but not destroyed, degraded, but not randomized. Who's right? Honestly, no one knows. We don't have the technology to test it. We can't revive a cryopreserved brain and see if the person returns. We can't even successfully revive a cryopreserved organ and have it function normally, let alone something as complex as a brain with identity intact. The entire premise rests on extrapolating current trends in technology forward decades or centuries, and hoping that the problems that seem unsolvable today become routine tomorrow. What we can say is this: the 500 people currently in cryonic preservation are preserved far better than the early attempts. Modern vitrification techniques are remarkably good at minimizing ice formation. Electron microscopy studies of vitrified brain tissue show preserved structures at the synaptic level. The information might be there. Whether it's recoverable is a question for a future we cannot see. And there's one final consideration that cryonics advocates raise, and it's philosophically interesting even if you reject the entire premise. Every person who chooses burial or cremation is making a decision that guarantees destruction of all neural information. 100% certain loss. Cryonics offers some probability above zero, however small. If you care about personal survival, if you value your continued existence, then even a tiny probability of success, multiplied by the potential reward, potentially infinite future life, yields a positive expected value. It's a gamble, absolutely. But it's a gamble against a certain loss. The bodies rest in their cylinders. The nitrogen boils away and is constantly replaced. The facilities maintain their watch. And the frozen weight? Their cells locked in glassy suspension, information preserved or destroyed, depending on physics and chemistry and future technologies no one can predict. They wait in the cold at minus 196 degrees Celsius, where molecular time nearly stops, where decay cannot reach them, where they are neither alive nor permanently dead, but something in between, something we don't yet have a proper word for. Suspended, preserved, paused, waiting. There's a moment between life and death that most people never think about. A liminal space where the person you were talking to yesterday is gone, but the body, the flesh, the billions of cells that carried consciousness are still present. For most people, this moment passes quickly and quietly. The body is cleaned, prepared, buried, or burned. But for those who choose cryonics, this moment becomes urgent, frantic, the beginning of a race against time that will determine whether their gamble has any chance at all. Let me walk you through what actually happens, step by step, from the moment of legal death to final storage in liquid nitrogen. Because this isn't a science fiction scenario. This is real procedure, practiced dozens of times each year, refined through decades of trial and error, executed by teams of technicians who've turned the theoretical into operational reality. The process actually begins before death, sometimes weeks or months before. When a cryonics member is diagnosed with a terminal illness or is clearly approaching end of life, they or their family notify the cryonics organization. This triggers what's called a standby deployment. A specialized team, usually 2 to 4 people, travels to wherever the patient is located. They bring equipment, lots of equipment, portable ice baths, mechanical CPR devices called thumpers, medications and solutions, monitoring equipment, transport containers. They check into a hotel near the hospital or hospice or home where the person is dying, and they wait. This standby period can last days or weeks. It's expensive. The team members are on call constantly, ready to respond within minutes. But it's absolutely critical because in cryonics, timing is everything. Every minute that passes after the heart stops, more damage accumulates in the brain. Cells begin dying immediately when deprived of oxygen. Enzymes that normally perform useful functions start breaking down cellular structures. The longer the delay between death and the beginning of preservation, the worse the outcome. Legal and medical complications make this even more fraught. The team cannot intervene while the person is still legally alive. That would be murder. They have to wait for a physician to declare legal death, which requires cessation of heartbeat and breathing. But they want to begin preservation as quickly as possible after that declaration. This creates tense situations. Medical staff who don't understand or approve of cryonics sometimes delay access to the body. Families experience the strange dissonance of grieving while technicians stand by waiting to begin work. Legal authorities occasionally intervene, treating the situation as suspicious. Then the moment comes. A physician declares death. The time is recorded, and immediately, within seconds, if the team is present, they begin. The first priority is maintaining circulation and oxygenation to the brain. Even though the heart has stopped, even though the person is legally dead, you can still push oxygenated blood through the circulatory system mechanically. The team places the body on a specialized board. They begin mechanical CPR, not gentle compressions, but aggressive, rapid chest compressions delivered by a pneumatic device that can maintain consistent pressure for hours. They intubate and provide oxygen. They inject medications, heparin to prevent blood clotting, and other drugs to protect the brain and cardiovascular system. This isn't resuscitation. The person is not coming back, but their brain is being kept in a state of marginal viability, buying precious time. As long as oxygenated blood reaches brain tissue, the catastrophic cascade of cell death is held at bay. Minutes become hours. Hours that can mean the difference between a brain that retains structural integrity and one that degrades into mush. Simultaneously, they begin cooling. The body is packed in ice, surrounded by ice baths, anything to drop the temperature as quickly as possible. Cold slows metabolism, slows decay, slows everything. For every 10 degrees Celsius you lower body temperature, chemical reaction rates roughly halve. Get the brain down to near freezing, and you've bought significantly more time before irreversible damage occurs. If everything goes perfectly, if the standby team is present at the moment of death, this entire initial response happens within 2 to 3 minutes. But everything rarely goes perfectly. Sometimes death occurs unexpectedly. Sometimes it happens in locations where the team can't be present. Sometimes there are legal complications, autopsies required by law, families who change their minds at the last moment. In those cases, hours or even days can elapse before preservation begins. The cryonics organizations will still perform the preservation, but everyone knows that the longer the delay, the more damage has accumulated, the worse the prognosis. Once initial stabilization is complete, the body needs to be transported to a facility equipped for cryoprotectant perfusion. Some cryonics organizations operate mobile perfusion units, specialized ambulances with all the necessary equipment. Others require transport to a fixed facility, Either way, the body travels packed in ice, with mechanical CPR continuing, maintaining that minimal circulation that keeps the brain from degrading further. Then comes perfusion, the most technically demanding part of the entire process. The body is placed on an operating table in a sterile environment. Surgical access is established to major blood vessels, usually through the chest, exposing the heart and the aorta. The perfusion circuit is connected, a system of pumps and heat exchangers and monitoring equipment that looks like something from a cardiac surgery suite, because that's essentially what it is. The team begins pumping in perfusate, a specially formulated solution at near freezing temperature. Initially, this is mostly a saline solution designed to flush out the blood. Blood is bad for long-term storage. It clots and degrades, so it needs to be removed. The solution is pumped in through the arterial system and drains out through the venous system, carrying blood with it. The team monitors outflow, watching the color change from deep red to pale pink to nearly clear as blood is replaced. This initial washout also further cools the body. The cold perfusate circulating through all the blood vessels drops core body temperature towards 0 degrees Celsius. Ice forms on the surface of the body. Frost rimes the fingertips. The flesh takes on a pale, waxy appearance. But internally, in the brain and organs, tissue remains just above freezing, protected by the constant circulation of cold fluid. Then comes the cryoprotectant. The perfusate is gradually changed, increasing concentrations of glycerol or dimethyl sulfoxide or proprietary mixtures developed by the cryonics organization. This has to happen slowly, over hours. Too rapid an introduction, and the osmotic shock would cause cells to shrink and rupture. Too slow, and ice begins forming despite the cryoprotectants. The team monitors constantly, adjusting concentrations, adjusting flow rates, adjusting temperatures, trying to achieve even distribution throughout the body. The brain is the focus of all this attention. Sensors in the perfusion circuit measure what's coming out of the jugular veins that drain the brain. Chemical analysis tells the team how much cryoprotectant has actually reached brain tissue. They're aiming for concentrations high enough to prevent ice formation, typically around 60% cryoprotectant by volume in the tissue. That's an enormous concentration, approaching the limit of what cells can tolerate even briefly. But it's necessary. Lower concentrations and ice forms. Ice means damage. Ice means failure. This perfusion process takes 8 to 12 hours. Throughout, the team watches for problems. Are there areas not perfusing well, where cryoprotectant isn't reaching? Is there edema, swelling that indicates cellular damage? Are the solutions flowing smoothly or encountering resistance? Every body responds differently. Younger bodies with healthy vasculature perfuse beautifully. Older bodies, bodies ravaged by disease, bodies with atherosclerosis, clogging blood vessels. These present challenges. Sometimes entire regions of the brain can't be reached. Sometimes the team does everything right and still knows the outcome will be poor. When perfusion is judged complete, when the brain tissue is saturated with cryoprotectant, the actual cooling to storage temperature begins. The body is placed in a specialized cooling box, sometimes called a big foot, and cooled gradually over several days down to minus 130 degrees Celsius using computer-controlled cooling protocols. This has to be slow, typically about 1 degree per hour, to minimize thermal stress and prevent fracturing. During this cooling, the body undergoes a phase transition. Around minus 120 degrees, the cryoprotectant saturated tissue vitrifies, turning from a soft biological material into something hard and glassy. If you tapped it, it would sound different, feel different. The person has become, in a very literal sense, a glass sculpture of themselves. Organic glass, but glass nonetheless. Finally, at minus 130 degrees, the body is ready for long-term storage. It's placed inside a sleeping bag, a literal sleeping bag, to provide a small amount of insulation and protection. Then it's lowered into a dewaar, a giant thermos flask filled with liquid nitrogen. These dewars are typically aluminum cylinders about 3 meters tall and 1 meter in diameter, looking like oversized propane tanks. They're heavily insulated and can hold 4 to 6 bodies depending on configuration. The bodies are stored head down. This is deliberate. As liquid nitrogen boils away, which it constantly does despite insulation, the level drops from the top. By storing heads at the bottom, they're the last part to be exposed if, in some catastrophic scenario, the nitrogen isn't replenished. It's a grim calculus, but pragmatic. If you have to choose what to preserve, preserve the brain. There's a variant procedure worth mentioning. Some patients choose neuropreservation, which means preserving only the head rather than the whole body. The logic is simple. The brain is what matters. The body is just support machinery that could theoretically be replaced with a cloned body or artificial systems in the future. Why pay to preserve and store mass that doesn't contain your identity? The procedure is similar to whole body preservation, except that after perfusion, the head is surgically separated and stored alone. It's less expensive, requires less storage space, and arguably makes sense from a purely information preservation standpoint. It's also considerably more disturbing to most people, which is why only about 20% of patients choose this option. Once in the dewaar, maintenance becomes routine but constant. Liquid nitrogen boils at minus 196 degrees Celsius. It's constantly evaporating, turning to gas and escaping. The dewars have to be topped off regularly, typically every 2 weeks, adding more liquid nitrogen to maintain the level. Sensors monitor temperature and nitrogen level continuously. Alarms trigger if anything goes wrong. The facilities have backup systems, multiple nitrogen sources, emergency protocols for power failures or natural disasters. And then, after all that frantic activity, after the standby and the CPR and the perfusion and the cooling, after the surgical precision and the careful monitoring, comes stillness. The body rests in its cylinder, submerged in liquid nitrogen, colder than any natural place on Earth, colder than the Antarctic winter, colder than the surface of Mars. The temperature is so low that thermal fluctuations barely exist. Molecular motion has nearly ceased. Time, in a biochemical sense, has effectively stopped. The procedure is complete. The person who died hours or days ago is now a cryonics patient, legally dead, but physically preserved, waiting in that strange state between existence and oblivion. And from this point forward, for years and decades and potentially centuries, the only thing required is patience and the steady replenishment of liquid nitrogen. 200 liters every few weeks. Electricity for the monitoring systems. Maintenance on the dewars. The ongoing operation of the facility. It sounds simple. It isn't. Organizations have failed. Funding has run out. Dewars have been neglected. Bodies have been lost to equipment failures, legal battles, and simple institutional collapse. The procedure might work perfectly, but preservation is not a single event. It's an ongoing commitment across timescales that exceed individual human lifetimes, requiring stability and resources that are anything but guaranteed. But when it works, when everything goes right, the result is this: a human body, brain intact, structures preserved, stored at temperatures where chemistry itself nearly stops, waiting. 500 people have undergone this procedure. 500 times, teams have raced against cellular decay and won, at least temporarily, at least well enough to preserve the structure. Whether they've preserved the person, whether identity survives this process, whether any of these bodies will ever wake, those questions remain unanswered, perhaps unanswerable, echoing in the cold silence of the storage dewars. 500 bodies rest in liquid nitrogen across facilities in the United States, Russia, and a few other countries. 500 individuals who made the same extraordinary choice. But who are they? What kind of person looks at death and decides to gamble on a technology that doesn't exist yet, to trust a future they'll never see until they wake in it, if they wake at all? The stereotype exists, of course. Rich eccentrics, Silicon Valley billionaires so in love with themselves they can't imagine the world without them. Narcissists who think they're too important to die. Science fiction, obsessives who can't distinguish fantasy from reality. The media loves this narrative because it's simple, and it confirms people's suspicions about the whole enterprise. The reality is more complex and more human. Start with demographics. The average cryonics patient, if we can call them that, is male. About 65% male overall. They tend to be educated, often with backgrounds in science, technology, engineering, or mathematics. Many worked in computing, software development, aerospace, or academic research. These are people comfortable with probabilistic thinking, with risk assessment, with long-term planning. They're the kind of people who fund retirement accounts in their 20s, who think about compound interest over decades, who make decisions based on expected value rather than emotion. But that's just the average. The individual stories are where it gets interesting. There are the true pioneers, people like James Bedford, frozen in the 1960s and 70s when the technology was primitive and the social stigma was overwhelming. These were idealists and risk-takers, people willing to be experimental subjects in an untested procedure because they believed it was humanity's next frontier. Many were involved in the space program or early computer development, fields where impossible things were becoming possible regularly. They looked at cryonics the same way they looked at landing on the moon, as an engineering problem, waiting for sufficient ingenuity and resources. Then there are the families, multiple members of the same family, preserved together. Parents and children, spouses frozen within years or months of each other. There's something deeply moving about these cases, even if you think the whole enterprise is misguided. These are people who couldn't bear separation, who made a pact that if there was even a chance of reunion in some distant future, they would take it together. Death might part them temporarily, but perhaps not permanently. The hope embedded in that decision is profound, even tragic. One of the most poignant categories is young people. Children who died of rare genetic diseases, of cancers, of accidents. Teenagers and young adults whose lives were cut short by circumstances beyond their control or anyone's ability to fix. Their parents made the choice to preserve them, unable to accept that their child's potential would never be realized. These cases divide opinion, even within the cryonics community. Is it a beautiful act of parental love, refusing to give up hope? Or is it a form of denial, an inability to grieve properly and let go? Consider a specific example, anonymized but representative. A 12-year-old girl diagnosed with an inoperable brain tumor. Over 18 months, she declined from a healthy, brilliant child to someone who could barely speak. Her parents, both scientists, had signed up for cryonics years earlier. As their daughter's condition worsened, they faced an impossible question. Should they include her in their plans? She was too young to meaningfully consent, but she was also too young to die with no possibility of ever having an adult life. They chose preservation. When she died, a standby team was present. The procedure went as well as could be hoped. She now rests in a facility in Arizona, her small body taking up less space than the adults surrounding her in the Dewar. Her parents continue their lives, continue their careers, continue paying the annual membership fees that fund the facility's operations. They might have 60 more years of life ahead of them. She's been frozen for 8 years already. If the technology ever works, she would wake without them, decades or centuries after they themselves were preserved and possibly revived. They know this. They chose it anyway. There are also the elderly futurists, people in their 70s and 80s and 90s who lived long enough to see extraordinary technological change and believe more is coming. These are people who were born before antibiotics, before computers, before space travel, before the internet. They watch the impossible become routine over and over. They're not afraid of death in a conventional sense. Many have had full lives, successful careers, children and grandchildren, but they're curious. They want to see what comes next. They frame cryonics not as fear, but as adventure, one more journey into unknown territory. The technology entrepreneurs are real, not just stereotypes. Programmers and engineers and startup founders who made enough money to afford the procedure and who think about mortality the same way they think about any other problem, as something to be debugged and optimized. Some are genuinely thoughtful about it, weighing probabilities and making rational choices. Others display a certain arrogance, an assumption that rules that apply to everyone else don't apply to them, that death is a bug in the human operating system waiting to be patched. Then there are the quiet ones, the ordinary people who saved for years or took out life insurance policies to fund their preservation. School teachers and accountants and small business owners. People who aren't wealthy or famous or particularly eccentric. They just read about cryonics, found the arguments compelling, and made arrangements. These are perhaps the most interesting cases because they're the hardest to dismiss. They're not deluded by wealth or fame. They're making a sober choice with limited resources, deciding that cryonics is worth the cost, even when that cost is significant relative to their means. Culturally, there are patterns. Cryonics remains predominantly an American phenomenon, with most patients from the United States. There are Russian patients, some Chinese patients, scattered individuals from Europe and other regions, but the bulk are American. This probably reflects several factors. The organizations are mostly American. The cultural acceptance of technological solutions to existential problems is very American. And the wealth required to afford preservation is more accessible in America than many places. Religious backgrounds vary more than you might expect. Yes, many patients are atheists or agnostics who see consciousness as purely material and therefore potentially preservable and restorable. But there are also Christians, Jews, Buddhists, people from various faith traditions who find ways to reconcile their religious beliefs with cryonic preservation. Some argue that if God grants humans the knowledge to defeat death, refusing that knowledge would be wrong. Others see it as simply extending life through medicine, no different in principle than antibiotics or surgery. The theological gymnastics can be elaborate, but faith and cryonics aren't automatically incompatible in everyone's mind. What about the psychological profiles? Are these people unusually afraid of death? The research, limited as it is, suggests something more nuanced. Many score high on measures of future orientation and openness to experience. They tend to be optimistic about technology and skeptical of tradition. They're often individuals who feel their identity and accumulated knowledge have value worth preserving. But they don't necessarily score higher on death anxiety than the general population. It's not that they're more afraid of dying. It's that they see an option others don't see and judge it worth taking. There are also the pets, dogs and cats, preserved at their owner's request, waiting in the same facilities as the humans. Some owners plan to be preserved alongside their pets, unwilling to leave them behind, even in death. To critics, this seems like the ultimate expression of denial and narcissism. To the owners, it's love. These animals were family. If there's a chance of reunion, however remote, however strange, why not take it? And finally, there are the people who are impossible to categorize. The artist who wanted to see how art would evolve over centuries. The historian fascinated by the idea of being primary source material for future historians. The person with severe chronic pain who hoped future medicine could fix what current medicine couldn't. The individual who simply couldn't accept that consciousness, this strange emergent property of matter that allows experience and thought and love should wink out forever when it could potentially continue. What unites all these people across demographics and motivations and life circumstances is a fundamental refusal of finality. They stand at the edge where every human before them has stepped off into oblivion, and they pause. They say, not yet, not if there's an alternative, not without trying something. Whether that makes them visionaries or fools, brave or deluded, depends entirely on whether it works, and no one knows if it works. Their families are left behind in a strange limbo, not widows and widowers in the traditional sense, because the person isn't really gone, not entirely. Not yet. The body still exists, preserved, theoretically recoverable. But they're not waiting by a hospital bed for recovery either. They're waiting for a future that might never come, for technologies that might never exist, for a reunion that exists only as mathematical possibility. Some find comfort in this, others find it torture. Many eventually stop paying the membership fees, stop visiting the facilities, move on with their lives, and let the frozen rest in their cold sleep without witnesses. 500 people, 500 stories, 500 gambles placed on the longest of long shots. They were children and elders, scientists and artists, believers and skeptics, rich and middle class. What they shared was a moment of choice, a decision point where they looked at the inevitable and chose to resist, to try something unprecedented, to become experimental subjects in an experiment that won't have results for decades or centuries. They rest now in their cylinders, their stories frozen with them, waiting for a future that will judge whether their choice was profound or pathetic, visionary or merely sad. But they made the choice. They acted. They refuse the passivity that death usually demands. And whatever else you might say about them, that refusal, that insistence on possibility over certainty, that gamble against the universe's apparent indifference, that is undeniably, recognizably, achingly human. Let's talk about money. Because cryonics, whatever else it might be, is also a business. Someone has to pay for the liquid nitrogen, the facilities, the staff, the equipment. Someone has to fund the decades or centuries of storage. And that someone is either the patient themselves or their estate, through mechanisms that reveal just how strange this entire enterprise becomes when you try to make eternal preservation economically viable. The numbers first. How much does it cost to be frozen? For whole body preservation at Alcor Life Extension Foundation, currently the largest and most established cryonics organization, the minimum is $200,000. The Cryonics Institute in Michigan offers whole body preservation for $28,000. Neuropreservation, preserving only the head, runs from $80,000 to $200,000 depending on the organization. These are substantial sums, though not as astronomical as many people assume. A $200,000 life insurance policy is affordable for many middle-class people, especially if purchased young. But here's where it gets interesting and complicated. That payment isn't a one-time service fee like paying for a funeral. It has to fund, potentially, unlimited storage. Think about what that means. You're paying today for services that might need to continue for 200 years, 500 years, 1,000 years. How do you price that? How do you ensure the money lasts? The cryonics organizations use a trust fund model. Your payment, whether from life insurance or personal assets, goes into a patient care trust. This trust is legally obligated to fund your ongoing storage. The organization invests the principal conservatively, typically in bonds and stable equities, and uses the investment returns to pay for liquid nitrogen, facility maintenance, and operations. The goal is for the trust to be self-sustaining indefinitely, with investment returns covering costs in perpetuity. This works elegantly in theory. If you can achieve even a modest real return above inflation, say 3 or 4% annually, and if storage costs remain relatively stable, then the trust can fund indefinite preservation. A $200,000 trust earning 4% annually generates $8,000 a year forever. If storage costs are less than that per patient, the system is sustainable. But the assumptions are enormous and fragile. First, you're assuming stable long-term investment returns, which is questionable over centuries. Markets fluctuate, economies collapse and rebuild. The entire structure of capitalism might change. Second, you're assuming storage costs remain manageable. What if liquid nitrogen becomes scarce or expensive? What if regulations require more expensive facilities? What if the organization needs to relocate due to climate change or political instability? Third, and most fundamentally, you're assuming institutional continuity. The organization must continue to exist and remain committed to its mission across time periods that exceed most institutions' lifespans. Most corporations don't last 50 years. Most nonprofits don't last 100. You're asking these organizations to function reliably for centuries, to maintain their purpose and competence across dozens of generations of management, through wars and economic collapses and technological disruptions no one can predict. The history of cryonics is littered with failures on exactly this point. The Cryonics Society of California, which preserved several patients in the 1970s, went bankrupt. The patients' storage was not maintained. Their bodies thawed and were eventually buried. The Cryonics Society of New York had similar problems. Families sued. Patients were lost. The early decades were chaotic, underfunded, marked by good intentions without sufficient financial planning or institutional structure. Modern organizations learned from these disasters. They established firmer legal foundations, more conservative financial practices, greater transparency. Alcor, founded in 1972, has maintained continuous operations for over 50 years now, an encouraging sign, but still just a fraction of the time required. The Cryonics Institute, founded by Robert Ettinger himself in 1976, has similar longevity. But 50 years is not 200 years. 200 years is not 1,000 years. There's also the question of what happens when money runs out anyway, despite best planning. Some patients' trusts are underfunded, either because they died before their life insurance fully matured or because their families couldn't afford the full amount. Organizations sometimes accept these patients anyway, subsidizing their storage from general funds or through donations. But this creates sustainability problems. If too many patients are underfunded, the organization's finances become precarious. Then there's the economic model of the organizations themselves. They need operating capital beyond patient storage. They need facilities, staff, research and development into better preservation techniques, legal defense, public relations. This funding comes from membership fees, donations, and sometimes from the patient trusts themselves, with a portion allocated to operational costs, rather than just individual storage. This creates a tension. The organization needs money to operate and improve, but every dollar spent on operations is a dollar not compounding in patient trusts. There's a constant balancing act between investing in better technology now and ensuring sufficient funds for storage later. Different organizations strike different balances, leading to different pricing models and different levels of service. Consider the price differences. Why can the Cryonics Institute offer preservation for $28,000 when Alcor charges $200,000? Partly, it's different service levels. Alcor emphasizes standby and rapid response, deploying teams to be present at the moment of death. The Cryonics Institute uses a more basic model where the body is shipped to them after death, often with delays that compromise preservation quality. Alcor's facilities are newer and more sophisticated. Their research budget is larger. You're paying for premium service and institutional stability. But there's also a philosophical difference about what counts as sufficient funding. The Cryonics Institute operates on a lean model, assuming that future technologies might make revival cheaper and easier than we imagine, or that future advocates will provide additional funding. Alcor takes a more conservative approach, trying to ensure that each patient's trust is fully self-sustaining indefinitely, with no additional help required. Neither approach is clearly right or wrong. Both involve bets about unknowable futures. Payment mechanisms matter too. Most patients use life insurance, specifically naming the Cryonics organization as beneficiary. This is clever because life insurance premiums, especially for young, healthy people, are relatively affordable. A 30-year-old can get a $200,000 term life policy for a few $100s annually. Convert that to permanent insurance with a paid-up addition, and you've secured your preservation funding for less than what many people spend on coffee annually. It makes cryonics accessible to middle-income individuals who could never write a $200,000 check. But life insurance has complications. Policies can lapse if premiums aren't paid. Beneficiaries can be changed. Families can contest the designation, arguing the person was mentally incompetent when they named the cryonics organization. Insurance companies sometimes challenge claims, especially if death occurs soon after the policy was purchased. All of this adds uncertainty and delay, often at the worst possible time, right when preservation needs to begin. Some patients try to fund preservation through their estates, setting aside assets in wills or trusts. This can work, but faces different challenges. Estates go through probate, which takes months. Families contest wills. Assets prove less liquid than expected. And meanwhile, the body waits, sometimes for so long that preservation becomes impossible, and the person is buried or cremated before funds are released. There's also a grimly practical question about incentives. The cryonics organization is paid when you die. They have no financial incentive for you to live a long life, and in fact, the longer you live, the longer they wait for payment while incurring membership administration costs. Now, no one seriously suggests that cryonics organizations want their members to die, but the incentive structure is oddly perverse. They succeed economically when their members fail biologically. Furthermore, consider the long-term economic assumptions built into this entire model. They assume that currency remains stable and meaningful across centuries, that property rights are respected, that the legal trusts protecting patient funds remain valid, that governments don't confiscate the assets or regulate the organizations out of existence, that future generations honor the commitments made by organizations that no longer exist in their original form. History suggests skepticism is warranted. How many institutions from the year 1800 still exist in recognizable form? How many financial instruments from 1900 still have value? We're asking these trusts to survive longer than the United States has existed as a nation, longer than industrial capitalism has existed as an economic system. The confidence required to believe this will work is staggering. Some patients address this by overfunding, leaving trusts significantly larger than the minimum requirement. The excess acts as a cushion against unforeseen problems and potentially funds research into revival technologies. Some wealthy individuals have endowed entire research institutes or funded cryonics-adjacent technology development. They're trying to buy not just their own preservation, but the advancement of the entire field, increasing the probability that revival becomes possible. There's also the question of what happens if you do get revived. Who owns your trust fund? If it's been growing for 300 years, even modest returns would make it enormous. Is it still yours? Does the organization keep it? Does the government tax it? Does the future society you wake into even have recognizable property rights? These questions are barely addressed in current contracts, understandably, since we have no framework for answering them. The economics extend beyond individual patients to the broader question of whether cryonics can survive as an industry. Current organizations are tiny, with combined revenues in the low millions annually. They operate on thin margins. A single lawsuit, a catastrophic equipment failure, or a loss of public confidence could collapse any of them. They're sustained largely by the dedication of members who work for below-market salaries because they believe in the mission. Can this scale? If cryonics became popular, If thousands or millions wanted preservation, could the economics work? Probably, actually. The per-patient storage cost drops significantly with scale. A facility holding 10,000 patients isn't 1,000 times more expensive to operate than one holding 10 patients. Liquid nitrogen costs the same regardless. The limiting factors would be initial capital for facilities and the trust fund model, which doesn't benefit from scale the same way operations do. But scale brings different problems. A fringe movement can persist on dedication and idealism. A mass industry requires regulation, standardization, consumer protection, government oversight, all of which would likely raise costs and impose restrictions that current organizations avoid by remaining small and obscure. So the economics of cryonics remain precarious. Not impossible, but dependent on assumptions that become less plausible the longer you examine them. Every patient is making a bet, not just on future technology, but on economic and institutional stability across timescales that exceed historical precedent. They're trusting that money, organizations, property rights, and social commitment will persist long enough for science to catch up with hope. The 500 currently preserved are the ultimate long-term investors, having paid their fees, signed their trusts, and bet their entire future existence on a financial and institutional structure that has to work perfectly for longer than any financial institution has ever existed. The money sits in accounts and trusts, compounds in the market, pays for liquid nitrogen deliveries and facility maintenance, year after year after year. The question that can't be answered is simple. Will it last? Will the money, the organizations, the commitment survive long enough for any of this to matter? The frozen weight in their expensive cylinders while accountants manage their trusts and markets fluctuate and time passes. The economics of eternity grind forward, spreadsheet by spreadsheet, trying to make infinity financially viable, trying to price the priceless, trying to buy with money what has never been for sale, a second chance at existence in a future no one can guarantee. The 500 people in cryonic suspension aren't waiting for a miracle. They're waiting for engineering. Specific, concrete technological advances that don't currently exist, but might plausibly emerge over the next century or two or three. Understanding what they're hoping for, what would actually need to happen for revival to work, reveals both the audacity of the gamble and why some serious scientists think it might not be completely insane. Start with the central problem: damage. Every preserved person sustains significant damage. The moments between heart stopping and preservation beginning caused ischemic damage as brain cells were deprived of oxygen. The perfusion process caused osmotic stress and toxic effects from high concentrations of cryoprotectants. The cooling caused thermal stress and possibly fracturing. And storage, even at minus 196 degrees Celsius, isn't perfectly stable. Background radiation, cosmic rays, and quantum effects cause gradual degradation over decades and centuries. So revival isn't just thawing and restarting. It's repair at a scale and precision that exceeds anything medicine can currently achieve. It requires fixing damage at the cellular level, possibly at the molecular level, throughout an entire brain and body. What technology could possibly do this? The answer cryonics advocates point to is molecular nanotechnology, specifically medical nanorobots. The concept, popularized by engineer K. Eric Drexler in the 1980s and refined since, envisions microscopic machines capable of manipulating individual molecules. These machines, small enough to travel through capillaries, could theoretically examine cells one by one, identify damage, and repair it using molecular precision. Imagine a swarm of billions of these nanorobots entering a cryopreserved brain. They would map the tissue first, using some form of scanning to understand the three-dimensional structure at molecular resolution. They would identify ruptured cell membranes, denatured proteins, severed axons, accumulated damage from storage. Then, following programmed instructions based on biological principles, they would rebuild. Repair membranes, refold proteins, reconnect neurons, remove cryoprotectants, and replace them with normal cellular constituents. Gradually, painstakingly, restore the tissue to functional condition. Is this possible? The physics doesn't forbid it. Life itself proves that molecular machines can exist and perform complex tasks. Every cell in your body contains ribosomes, which are essentially molecular factories that build proteins based on genetic instructions. Enzymes are molecular machines that catalyze specific chemical reactions. Motor proteins move cargo through cells with nanometer precision. Biology runs on molecular nanotechnology. The question is whether we can engineer synthetic versions with sufficient capability and control. Current progress is encouraging but preliminary. Scientists have built simple molecular machines. In 2016, a team won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for developing molecular motors and switches. Researchers have created DNA origami, folding DNA strands into specific shapes that can perform basic mechanical tasks. Medical nanoparticles are already used to deliver drugs to specific tissues in living patients. These are primitive compared to what revival would require, but they demonstrate that the field is advancing. The timeline is anyone's guess. Optimists suggest sophisticated medical nanorobots might exist within 50 to 100 years. Pessimists say never, that the engineering challenges are insurmountable, that the complexity of biological systems will always exceed our ability to repair them at molecular scale. The truth likely lies somewhere between, dependent on continued research funding, breakthrough discoveries, and whether the theoretical capabilities translate to practical engineering. But nanotechnology isn't the only possible path to revival. Some researchers explore alternatives that might be more achievable. One approach focuses on brain plasticity and the surprising robustness of neural information. The brain isn't a hard drive where data is stored in precise locations. It's a dynamic network where information is distributed across patterns of connections. Studies of brain damage survivors show remarkable recovery as healthy regions compensate for damaged areas. This suggests that some loss of precision might be tolerable, that you could restore function even without perfect molecular repair. Another approach involves brain mapping and simulation. If you could scan a cryopreserved brain at sufficient resolution, creating a complete three-dimensional map of every neuron and every synapse, you might not need to repair the biological tissue at all. You could theoretically create a computational model of that brain and run it on a computer or upload it to a synthetic substrate. This is the idea of mind uploading or whole brain emulation. This approach has different requirements than biological revival. You don't need nanobots. You need extraordinarily powerful microscopy, probably using electron microscopy or more advanced techniques, capable of imaging the entire brain at synaptic resolution. You need artificial intelligence, sophisticated enough to interpret that data and build an accurate model. And you need computational power sufficient to simulate 86 billion neurons and trillions of synapses in real time. Current technology can map small pieces of brain tissue at synaptic resolution. The entire brain of a fruit fly has been mapped this way, requiring heroic effort and years of work. A human brain is roughly 1,000,000 times more complex. The data storage alone would be immense, measured in exabytes. The computational requirements to simulate it in real time would exceed current supercomputers by orders of magnitude. But these are scaling problems, not fundamental physics problems. Computing power increases. Storage capacity increases. What's impossible today becomes routine in decades. The philosophical questions around uploading are profound. If a computer simulation of your brain runs, is it you? Does it have consciousness? Does it matter that it's software rather than neurons? Would revival by uploading satisfy the goals of people who chose cryopreservation? Or would it be a different kind of death, creating a copy while the original remains frozen? These questions divide even cryonics advocates. Some would accept upload as true revival. Others insist on biological restoration, maintaining continuity with the physical brain. There's also the regenerative medicine approach. Perhaps by the time revival is attempted, science will have advanced to where we can grow new bodies from DNA and transplant the brain into a young, healthy form. Or use stem cell technology to regenerate damaged organs in place. Or employ gene therapy to restart biological processes without needing molecular repair of all damage. Medical science has advanced enormously over the past century. Organ transplantation, once impossible, is now routine. Gene editing with CRISPR allows precise modifications to DNA. Stem cells can be directed to become almost any tissue type. Extrapolate these trends forward a century or two, and what might be possible? Perhaps damage that seems irreparable with current technology becomes straightforward with future techniques. Perhaps revival requires not one breakthrough technology, but a combination of many, each solving a different piece of the puzzle. Nanobots repair cellular damage, stem cells regenerate tissues, advanced AI monitors and coordinates the process. Gene therapy addresses underlying disease. It becomes a comprehensive medical procedure, complex but achievable. The optimism isn't entirely unfounded. Consider what was impossible in medicine a century ago. In 1925, there were no antibiotics. Infections that are trivial today were death sentences. There was no chemotherapy, no organ transplantation, no cardiac surgery, no mechanical ventilation, no dialysis, no immunosuppression allowing organ acceptance. A person dying of kidney failure in 1925 would have seemed impossible to save. Yet today, we save such patients routinely. Cryonics advocates argue their situation is similar. What seems impossible today, revival from cryopreservation, might be routine medicine in 2125 or 2225. They point to the accelerating pace of biomedical advancement. The first human genome was sequenced in 2003 at a cost of billions of dollars. Today, you can sequence a genome for hundreds of dollars. The technology improved by orders of magnitude in 2 decades. Apply similar improvement curves to nanotechnology, to brain mapping, to regenerative medicine, and revival starts looking plausible. But there's a critical assumption buried in all this optimism, that the information defining identity persists in the frozen tissue. If cryopreservation destroys the pattern of neural connections that encode memory and personality, then no future technology, no matter how sophisticated, can retrieve what's lost. You can't unshred a document if the pieces are randomized. You can't restore a painting if the paint molecules are scattered. The structure must persist, even if damaged, even if requiring repair. This is where the scientific debate becomes sharpest. Critics argue that ice formation, even minimal ice formation, destroys synaptic connections at the molecular level, that the precise arrangements of proteins and lipids that encode information are lost, that what remains is biological tissue in a general sense, but not the specific pattern that constituted the individual. It's the difference between a working hard drive and a pile of silicon. The material is there, but the data is gone. Proponents counter with evidence from electron microscopy studies of vitrified brain tissue. These studies, conducted on animal tissue and on small samples of human brain from cryopreserved patients, show preserved structures at synaptic resolution. You can see neurons. You can see synapses. The connections are visible, perhaps damaged, perhaps degraded, but present. The pattern persists, at least partially. And if partial information remains, sophisticated enough future technology might be able to interpolate the missing pieces, fill in gaps based on biological principles and probability. There's also the question of what level of preservation is sufficient. Do you need every molecule in exactly the right place? Or is there redundancy, error correction, tolerance for imperfection built into how brains store information? No one knows precisely, because we don't fully understand how memory and identity are encoded at the physical level. This ignorance cuts both ways. Maybe the requirements are impossibly strict. Maybe they're more forgiving than we think. Another consideration is that future revival technology could include elements we can't currently imagine. In the 1800s, no one could have predicted antibiotics, chemotherapy, or gene editing because the underlying science wasn't understood. Similarly, scientific advances over the next century might reveal entirely new approaches to the problem of repair and revival. Perhaps quantum computing enables simulation approaches that are inconceivable now. Perhaps AI achieves capabilities that make currently impossible tasks routine. Perhaps new physics reveals methods of manipulating matter we haven't dreamed of. This is where the gamble becomes clear. The cryonics patients are betting that the damage they sustained is below some threshold of irreversibility, that sufficient information persists, and that future technology will advance enough to bridge the gap. It's a bet on multiple contingencies, all of which must resolve favorably. The odds are unknown. Optimists say better than 50-50. Pessimists say effectively zero. Honest assessment says we simply don't know because we're trying to predict technologies that don't exist to solve problems we don't fully understand. But here's what makes the bet rational, at least from certain philosophical perspectives. The alternative is certain obliteration. Burial or cremation guarantees complete destruction of structure and information. Cryopreservation preserves something, even if damaged. And as long as some probability exists above zero, however small, the expected value calculation can favor preservation. A 1% chance of revival, multiplied by potentially infinite future life, yields substantial expected value compared to zero chance. So the 500 wait in their cylinders, their fate bound to technologies that exist only as theories and speculations and trends. They wait for nanotechnology that might or might not prove feasible, for brain mapping that might or might not capture enough information, for regenerative medicine that might or might not advance sufficiently. for future generations that might or might not honor their commitments and attempt revival. They wait suspended between existence and extinction, their hope tethered to the long arc of scientific progress, trusting that the curve bends toward capability, toward understanding, toward the moment when death might finally become negotiable rather than absolute. Whether that hope is justified, whether the science will deliver, whether anyone frozen today will ever wake, remains the central unanswered question. Time alone will tell. And time is something they now have in abundance, frozen at the edge of possibility, waiting for the future to catch up with their extraordinary gamble. For every person who sees cryonics as a rational hedge against oblivion, there are dozens who see it as pseudoscience, delusion, or worse. The criticism comes from multiple directions: from hard-nosed scientists, from ethicists, from religious authorities, from people who simply find the entire enterprise distasteful. Understanding these objections is essential because they reveal not just skepticism about cryonics specifically, but deeper questions about mortality, meaning, and what it means to live a human life. Start with the scientific criticism, which is substantial and comes from credible sources. The majority of neuroscientists, cryobiologists, and medical researchers who've examined cryonics conclude that it doesn't work and likely can't work with foreseeable technology. Their objections aren't based on hostility or ignorance. They're based on detailed understanding of what freezing does to tissue and how difficult, perhaps impossible, repair would be. The central scientific objection focuses on information loss. When brain tissue freezes, even with cryoprotectants, ice crystals form at least in some regions. These crystals don't just damage tissue mechanically. They disrupt the precise molecular arrangements that encode memory and identity. Synaptic connections depend on specific proteins being in specific locations, on particular configurations of receptors and ion channels, on exact patterns of dendritic spines and axonal terminals. Ice formation randomizes these arrangements at the nanometer scale. Critics argue that this isn't damage in the sense of a broken bone that can heal or a severed nerve that can be reconnected. It's information destruction comparable to scrambling the bits on a hard drive. The data isn't just corrupted, it's gone. No amount of future technology can recover information that no longer exists in any form. You can repair tissue, grow new neurons, reconnect pathways, but you cannot reconstruct the specific pattern that made that brain encode that particular person's memories and personality. Furthermore, even if vitrification were perfect, which it isn't, the damage begins before preservation. In the minutes or hours between clinical death and the start of cryoprotectant perfusion, cells die and structures degrade. This isn't theoretical, it's observable. Ischemic damage is well studied. We know what happens when brains are deprived of oxygen. Cells undergo programmed death sequences. Membranes rupture. Enzymes that normally maintain cellular structure instead begin breaking it down. This damage is happening while the standby team performs CPR and cooling, damage that accumulates with every passing minute. Some scientific critics go further, arguing that even if tissue could be perfectly preserved, we don't understand consciousness and identity well enough to know what needs to be preserved. Perhaps identity depends not just on synaptic connections, but on precise molecular states, on quantum effects, on subtle properties that cryopreservation inevitably destroys. We're trying to preserve something we don't fully understand using methods we hope are sufficient. The arrogance embedded in that attempt troubles many scientists. The Society for Cryobiology, the main professional organization for scientists studying biological effects of low temperatures, is so skeptical that it explicitly prohibits members from involvement with cryonics organizations. The Society's position is that cryonics organizations misrepresent the science, give false hope to vulnerable people, and damage the reputation of legitimate cryobiology research. Whether this ban is justified or represents inappropriate gatekeeping is debated, but it demonstrates the depth of skepticism in the relevant scientific community. Beyond the purely scientific objections are ethical criticisms. These focus on what cryonics reveals about values, priorities, and how we relate to mortality. One common ethical objection is about resource allocation. Cryopreservation is expensive, not just for individuals, but for society. The resources spent preserving and storing these bodies, the scientific talent that goes into improving preservation techniques, the money sitting in trusts for decades, all of this could address urgent needs, feed the hungry, house the homeless, fund medical research into diseases affecting millions. Instead, resources flow toward a speculative attempt to benefit a tiny number of wealthy individuals. This criticism has force. There's something troubling about a world where people die from preventable diseases due to lack of resources while others spend hundreds of thousands trying to preserve their already lived lives indefinitely. The priorities seem inverted, selfish, a manifestation of privilege where those who've had the most want even more while others get nothing. Cryonics advocates counter that it's individuals' own money spent on their own goals. They're not taking resources from others any more than someone who buys an expensive car or takes luxury vacations. In a market economy, people are free to spend their resources on whatever they value, even if others judge those choices foolish. Moreover, research into cryopreservation might yield benefits for other medical applications, like organ preservation for transplantation. The criticism assumes resources are zero-sum, but innovation often generates unexpected value. Still, there's an aesthetic and moral dimension that goes beyond economics. Cryonics embodies a particular worldview that many find fundamentally wrong. It treats death as a problem to solve rather than a natural part of life. It prioritizes individual survival over acceptance and grace. It assumes more life is always better. That quantity matters more than quality. That extending existence justifies extraordinary measures even at the expense of dignity. Many religious traditions explicitly reject this worldview. In Christianity, the focus is on eternal life through faith, not through technology. The body is a temporary vessel. What matters is the soul's destination, not the flesh's preservation. Attempting to cheat death through cryonics might even constitute a rejection of God's plan, an attempt to usurp divine authority over life and death. Similar objections exist in Islam, where death is a transition ordained by Allah, not something to be indefinitely postponed. Buddhist perspectives vary, but often emphasize acceptance of impermanence as essential to enlightenment. Attachment to continued existence is exactly the craving that causes suffering. Cryonics represents the ultimate attachment, the refusal to let go, the grasping at permanence in a universe defined by change. From this view, choosing cryopreservation isn't just futile, it's spiritually harmful, reinforcing the very delusions that prevent liberation. Even secular humanists and existentialists often object to cryonics, not on religious grounds, but on philosophical ones. Death provides meaning to life. The finitude of existence is what makes choices matter, what makes relationships precious, what gives urgency and significance to how we spend our time. Remove death, and you remove meaning. An infinite life would be an empty life, stripped of the stakes that make human experience profound. The philosopher Bernard Williams argued this in his famous essay on immortality. He suggested that an immortal life would eventually become unbearable, either because you remain yourself and eventually exhaust all meaningful experiences, leading to terminal boredom, or because you change enough to remain interested and you're no longer the same person, making the extended life not really yours. Either way, indefinite life extension defeats its own purpose. Cryonics patients might wake into a future so alien that they're essentially refugees from the past, stripped of context and connection. Everyone they loved would be gone, their skills obsolete, their language possibly archaic, their values strange to future generations. They'd be isolated strangers in a world they don't understand, living not because life is valuable, but simply because revival was possible. The loneliness embedded in that scenario is profound and rarely acknowledged. There are also practical and social criticisms. Cryonics organizations are small, fragile institutions with unclear long-term viability. Entrusting your potential revival to organizations that might not exist in 50 years, let alone 200, seems imprudent. The history of failed cryonics organizations and thawed bodies demonstrates the risk. You're gambling not just on future technology, but on social and institutional continuity across timescales that exceed most human institutions. Moreover, what would society do with revived individuals? If revival becomes possible and thousands or millions are brought back, they'd compete for resources with the living. They'd have legal claims on property held in trust, potentially disrupting future economies. They'd need to be integrated, educated, employed in a world they don't understand. The social disruption could be enormous, possibly triggering political backlash or even violence against the revived. The individuals frozen today are assuming future generations will be welcoming and supportive. History suggests otherwise. Some critics focus on the psychological dimensions. They argue that choosing cryonics represents pathological death denial, an inability to accept reality, a form of narcissism that privileges one's own continued existence above all else. Healthy mortality acceptance involves facing death with courage, finding meaning despite finitude, focusing on legacy and community rather than individual survival. Cryonics represents the opposite, a retreat into fantasy, a refusal of the existential challenge that defines human maturity. This psychological criticism may be overstated. Many cryonics advocates seem psychologically healthy, functioning well in life, maintaining relationships, and pursuing meaningful goals. Their choice reflects a different value system rather than pathology. But there's something to the observation that death acceptance is part of wisdom, that endless life extension might reflect an impoverished sense of meaning rather than an enriched one. The cultural criticism focuses on who chooses cryonics and what that reveals. It's predominantly white, male, wealthy, Western individuals. This isn't coincidental. Cryonics embodies assumptions about individual autonomy, technological solutions, and personal future that are culturally specific. Many cultures emphasize collective over individual, acceptance over control, spiritual over material. Cryonics makes no sense within those frameworks. Its appeal is narrow, reflecting particular cultural anxieties and aspirations rather than universal human concerns. Finally, there's the simple aesthetic objection. Many people find cryonics creepy, undignified, disrespectful to the dead. The image of bodies stored head down in cylinders, the industrial coldness of the facilities, the transactional nature of the entire enterprise, all of this violates intuitions about how death should be handled. We want death to be sacred, or at least dignified. We want bodies to rest, not to be indefinitely stored like inventory. The machinery and commercialism of cryonics offend sensibilities about mortality that run deeper than rational argument. Are these criticisms fair? Some are, some aren't. The scientific skepticism is legitimate and well-founded, though not necessarily conclusive, since we're debating unknowable future capabilities. The ethical objections raise important questions about values and priorities, though they sometimes overstate the social cost and understate individual liberty. The religious and philosophical criticisms reflect coherent worldviews, but aren't universal. The practical concerns about institutional stability are very real. The psychological and aesthetic objections may say more about the critic's values than about cryonics itself. What's clear is that cryonics exists in a space of profound disagreement about fundamental questions. What makes life meaningful? How should we relate to death? What are legitimate uses of technology and resources? What obligations do we have to others versus ourselves? These aren't questions with obvious answers. They're precisely the questions that separate different philosophical and religious traditions, different cultural assumptions, different personal values. The 500 people in cryonic suspension made their choice knowing these criticisms exist. They heard the skepticism and decided it didn't apply to them or didn't outweigh the potential benefit. They looked at the objections, scientific and ethical and philosophical and aesthetic, and concluded that the chance of revival, however small, justified the cost and the strangeness and the social judgment. They chose the gamble over the certainty. Whether they were brave or foolish, rational or deluded, visionary or narcissistic, depends entirely on which set of values and assumptions you bring to the question. There's no neutral ground here, no perspective from which the answer is obvious. There's only the choice, made individually, to accept death as final or to try, however improbably, to keep the door open just a crack, to maintain some thread of possibility against the darkness. The frozen rest in their cylinders while the world debates their choice, offering no answers, only more cold and more time. There are only a handful of places in the world where humans rest at minus 196 degrees Celsius. Facilities that are part morgue, part laboratory, part warehouse, and part something entirely new, something we don't have a proper name for yet. Let's walk through one of these spaces, understand what they look like, how they operate, and what it feels like to stand among the frozen. The Alcor Life Extension Foundation facility sits in Scottsdale, Arizona, an unlikely location for humanity's most ambitious bet against death. The building is industrial, unremarkable from outside. You could drive past it 100 times and never guess what's inside. There's no dramatic architecture, no mystical symbolism. It looks like a small warehouse or research facility, which is exactly what it is. The only unusual feature is the high level of security, cameras, and access controls protecting against intrusion. Inside, the facility divides into functional zones. There are offices where staff handle administration, membership services, and planning. There are operating rooms equipped for cryoprotectant perfusion, looking much like cardiac surgery suites with stainless steel tables, pumps, monitoring equipment, and cabinets full of medical supplies. There are preparation areas where bodies are cooled gradually before final storage. And then there's the patient care bay, where the douars stand. The douars themselves are surprisingly large. Each one is roughly 3 meters tall and 1 meter in diameter, cylindrical, made of aluminum with thick insulation. They weigh several tons when full. They look somewhat like oversized propane tanks, industrial and functional rather than futuristic. They're painted white, labeled with identification codes. There's nothing poetic about them. They're storage vessels, engineered for a specific purpose, doing their job quietly, year after year. Inside each douar are 4 to 6 patients, depending on configuration. Whole-body patients are placed in sleeping bags for protection and lowered into position head down. Neuropreservation patients, just heads, take up less space, allowing more per douar. They're not floating freely, but are secured in place within the douar structure. The liquid nitrogen surrounds them completely, maintaining constant temperature. Stand in the patient care bay, and you feel the cold radiating from the douars, even from several feet away. The air around them shimmers slightly with vapor as nitrogen boils off, a constant gentle mist. The sound is quiet but persistent, a soft hiss and gurgle as the liquid nitrogen moves and evaporates. The temperature in the room is carefully controlled, cool but not uncomfortable, to minimize thermal stress on the doers. Each doer requires regular maintenance. Every 2 weeks, technicians add more liquid nitrogen to replace what's evaporated. They check sensor readings, monitor temperature profiles, inspect for any signs of structural problems. They keep detailed logs of every intervention, every measurement, every deviation from normal. This routine maintenance is unglamorous, but critical. Miss too many nitrogen refills and temperature rises. Let a doer develop a leak and vacuum insulation fails. These are catastrophic failures that would thaw patients, destroying decades of preservation in hours. The staff who work here are an interesting mix. Some are true believers, cryonics members themselves who've dedicated their careers to the movement. They speak of the patients with reverence, as sleeping members of a community they're protecting. Others are more pragmatic technicians and administrators who see it as an interesting job, unusual but not mystical. A few are scientists who find the technical challenges compelling, even if they're skeptical about ultimate success. The facility operates 24 hours a day, though not always with staff present. Monitoring systems track every douar continuously, sending alerts to on-call personnel if anything goes wrong. There are backup power systems, backup nitrogen supplies, protocols for every conceivable emergency. The paranoia is justified. A single point of failure, a missed alarm, an inadequate response could thaw patients who've been preserved for decades. There's also the surgery bay, where new patients are processed. This is where the teams work frantically when a patient dies, where the perfusion happens, where hours of intense medical procedure transform a dead body into a cryopreserved patient. The equipment is sophisticated, expensive, maintained to hospital standards. When not in active use, the room is sterile and empty, waiting for the next call, the next death, the next preservation. Visitors to Alcor and similar facilities report strange emotional reactions. Some find it peaceful, even comforting. These are people who've made their choice, and seeing the facility reassures them that their arrangements are real, that the organization is professional and serious. Others find it deeply unsettling, confronting the physical reality of death preserved, bodies stored like inventory, the industrial coldness of the entire operation. The dissonance between the profound implications and the mundane execution disturbs people. There's also the memorial wall, where many facilities display photographs and names of patients. These faces staring from frames are the frozen, reduced to images and dates. Born 1935, preserved 1998. Born 1952, preserved 2015. Each photograph represents someone who made this extraordinary choice, someone whose family arranged this, someone who rests meters away in a douar at temperatures that would freeze carbon dioxide solid. The Cryonics Institute in Michigan operates similarly, but with different emphases. Their facility is more utilitarian, less focused on the high-touch service model. The douars are larger, holding more patients each. The costs are lower. The philosophy is that what matters is preservation, not amenities. They've focused on efficiency and sustainability, on making cryonics affordable to more people, even if that means less individual attention and fewer premium services. In Russia, Cryonics operates the only cryonics facility outside North America. Located near Moscow, it serves patients from Russia, Ukraine, and other former Soviet states. The cultural context is different, the patient demographics somewhat different, but the basic technology is the same. Liquid nitrogen at -196 degrees. DWARs containing bodies and heads. Staff maintaining the facility year after year. The universal features of cryonic preservation transcend culture. What's the emotional atmosphere in these facilities? It varies by who you ask. Staff speak of it as a workplace, unusual certainly, but one where they perform technical tasks that become routine. Maintenance schedules, paperwork, equipment checks. The extraordinary becomes ordinary through repetition. They're not constantly meditating on mortality and technology. They're doing their jobs. Family members who visit sometimes report feeling closer to their deceased loved ones here than at traditional grave sites. The person is present in a way they wouldn't be if buried or cremated. The body still exists, preserved, theoretically recoverable. Some families visit regularly, sitting quietly near the douar, containing their parent or spouse or child. Others never visit after the initial preservation, finding it too painful or strange, preferring to remember the person as they were rather than confront the reality of their frozen suspension. There are also the members, living people who've arranged their own eventual preservation, who sometimes tour the facilities or attend events. For them, the facility represents their own future. They're seeing where they'll spend the indefinite time between death and potential revival. Some find this comforting, a concrete manifestation of their plans. Others find it sobering, confronting the reality of what they've arranged in abstract. The gleaming surgical equipment, the industrial douars, the quiet cold, all of it becomes real in a way paperwork and fees never quite capture. Security is a constant concern. These facilities contain vulnerable targets. There are people who oppose cryonics and might attempt to disrupt operations or damage equipment. There are potential thieves who might target the facilities for equipment or supplies. Most concerning are scenarios where social instability or legal challenges threaten the organization's ability to operate. Facilities maintain security systems, have legal protections, work to maintain positive relationships with local authorities. But ultimately, they're small organizations with limited resources, vulnerable to numerous threats. Natural disasters present another challenge. What happens if an earthquake strikes? If wildfires approach? If flooding threatens? Each facility has emergency protocols. DWARs can be moved if necessary, though it's complicated and risky. Organizations maintain relationships with backup facilities. But these plans are theoretical and might not survive actual catastrophic events. A major disaster could result in patients being lost despite everyone's best efforts. The long-term stability question hangs over everything. These facilities need to operate not for years, but for centuries. The buildings will require maintenance and eventual replacement. Equipment will need upgrading. Staff will turn over generation after generation. The organizations must remain solvent, committed, technically competent across timescales that exceed most institutions. Standing in these facilities, looking at the DWARs, you're seeing a snapshot of a system that needs to persist essentially forever, and the fragility of that commitment becomes apparent. Yet they persist. Day after day, year after year, the facilities operate. Nitrogen is delivered. Temperatures are monitored. New patients arrive and are carefully preserved and added to the DWARs. The living staff move through the spaces, maintaining the equipment, keeping records, ensuring that the frozen remain frozen, that the cold holds, that the patients rest undisturbed in their suspension. There's something both mundane and profound about these spaces. On one level, they're just facilities, industrial spaces where technical work happens. On another level, they're unlike anywhere else on Earth, repositories of frozen hope, places where hundreds of people wait in chemical stasis for futures that may never come. They're monuments to human stubbornness and ingenuity and perhaps folly, temples of a strange faith in technology and time. Walk through these facilities, and you're walking through a question that has no answer yet. You're surrounded by people who rejected death's finality, who bet against the universe's apparent indifference, who chose the longest of long shots. They rest in their cylinders, cold beyond cold, while the world outside continues, while seasons change and years pass and technology advances or doesn't, while the future they trusted unfolds in ways they cannot see. The facilities maintain their watch. The nitrogen boils and is replaced. The monitors display steady readings. The staff come and go. And the frozen wait in silence and darkness and cold, neither alive nor permanently dead, suspended in the strange space between hope and oblivion, dreaming whatever dreams, if any, consciousness has at minus 196 degrees Celsius. We've walked through the history, the science, the procedure, the economics, the criticisms, the facilities. We've examined cryonics from every practical angle. But now, at the end, we need to step back and ask what all of this means. Not whether it works, we can't answer that yet, but what it reveals about us, about how humans relate to mortality, about what we value and fear and hope for in the face of the one certainty that has defeated every person who has ever lived. 500 people are frozen. That number seems small until you remember that every single one represents a radical choice, a decision to reject the script that humanity has followed since we first became conscious enough to understand death. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans have died. We've developed elaborate rituals around death, complex beliefs about what happens after, sophisticated philosophies for accepting the inevitable. Every culture has found ways to make peace with mortality, to find meaning despite or because of our finitude. And then these 500 people said no. Not acceptance, not peace, not surrender to the natural order. Instead, they chose to fight with the only weapons available to them: technology and money and hope. They chose to preserve their bodies at temperatures that would freeze steel solid, to trust organizations that might not outlive them by more than decades, to bet on futures they could not see, and technologies that did not exist. It's an extraordinary act of defiance or an extraordinary act of delusion, and we won't know which for a very long time. What does this tell us about human nature? Perhaps that we are fundamentally unwilling to accept limits. We are the species that looked at the sky and decided to fly, that looked at the moon and decided to walk there, that looked at diseases that killed millions and decided to eliminate them. Every impossible thing humanity has achieved began with someone refusing to accept that it was impossible. Cryonics fits this pattern. Death seems absolute. Biology appears final. And yet there are people who refuse to accept this, who look for the loophole, the edge case, the technical solution. This stubbornness has driven human progress. Most of our ancestors died of things we now consider trivial: infections, tooth abscesses, childbirth complications, winter cold. These were facts of life, unavoidable, accepted as natural, until people refused to accept them and invented antibiotics, dentistry, obstetric medicine, heating systems. What was inevitable became preventable. What was accepted became outrageous. The line between what we accept and what we fight has moved continuously throughout history. So when cryonics advocates argue that death is just another medical problem awaiting better technology, they're extending a logic humans have applied successfully for millennia. Why should we accept death when we've refused to accept so many other limits? Why should this particular boundary be sacred when we've crossed every other? It's a coherent argument, even if uncomfortable. But there's another way to understand these 500 frozen people. Perhaps they represent not human ingenuity, but human fear. The terror of non-existence, of the self being extinguished, of consciousness ending forever. This fear is profound and perhaps universal. We cannot imagine not existing. We cannot experience our own absence. Every moment of our lives, we are present, conscious, experiencing. The idea that this simply stops, that experience ends and never resumes, is cognitively difficult and emotionally unbearable. Most humans manage this fear through denial of various kinds: religious belief in afterlife, philosophical focus on legacy and meaning, simple distraction and not thinking about it too much. Cryonics might be another form of denial, a technological version of religious immortality promises. Instead of heaven, we promise future revival. Instead of faith, we trust science. But the psychological function is similar, creating a narrative where death isn't final, where some form of continuation remains possible. If this interpretation is correct, then cryonics isn't really about rational calculation of probabilities. It's about managing existential terror. The people who choose it aren't necessarily more rational than those who don't. They're just managing their fear differently, with technology and money instead of faith and ritual. Their choice reveals not their superior logic, but their particular psychology, their inability or unwillingness to make peace with mortality in traditional ways. Which interpretation is right? Probably both contain truth. Humans are complex. We're capable of rational planning and emotional reaction simultaneously. The same person can make careful probability calculations and be driven by barely conscious fears. Cryonics likely attracts people who combine technological optimism with death anxiety, who channel their fear into a plan that feels active and concrete rather than passive acceptance. There's also something distinctly modern about cryonics. It could only emerge in a culture that values individual survival above almost everything else, that treats death as failure rather than transition, that believes technology can solve any problem given sufficient time and resources. These are not universal human values. Many cultures emphasize the collective over the individual, acceptance over control, spiritual over material. In those contexts, cryonics makes little sense. It's solving a problem that isn't considered a problem. This raises uncomfortable questions about whose values should guide our relationship with mortality. Is the modern Western emphasis on individual survival and technological solution progress or poverty? Have we gained something by rejecting traditional death acceptance? Or have we lost wisdom that served humanity well for millennia? There's no obvious answer. Both perspectives have merit. Both reflect genuine human concerns. Consider what revival would actually mean if it happens. You wake in a world perhaps 2 centuries advanced. Everyone you knew is gone. Your children died decades or centuries ago. Your grandchildren lived and died, and their grandchildren too, unknown to you. The world has changed in ways you cannot predict. Languages evolved. Technology transformed. The social context you understood no longer exists. You are a refugee from the past, possessing knowledge and experience that might be obsolete, lacking context for understanding your new world. This scenario is either terrifying or exciting, depending on your temperament. Some people would embrace it, curious about the future, eager to explore, treating it as the ultimate adventure. Others would find it devastating, stripped of everything that gave life meaning, isolated in time as thoroughly as if exiled to an alien planet. The cryonics patients are gambling, not just that revival is possible, but that they'd want to live in the world that revives them. There's also the question of what obligations the future owes the past. Why should people in 2200 spend resources reviving someone from 2000? What claim does the frozen past have on the living future? Perhaps future generations will honor the commitment, revive everyone they can, integrate them with compassion and support. Or perhaps they'll view the frozen with contempt or indifference, unplugging the doers to save electricity, letting them thaw and disposing of them as a strange historical curiosity. We cannot bind the future to our wishes. We can only hope they'll be generous. And yet, despite all the uncertainties, despite the criticisms, despite the long odds, those 500 people made their choice. They looked at the absolute finality of traditional death and at the radical uncertainty of cryonic preservation. And they chose uncertainty. They chose the possibility, however remote, over the certainty of oblivion. They chose to remain in the game rather than fold their hand. From a certain perspective, that's not irrational at all. It's the most rational choice possible when the alternative is certain loss. This brings us to perhaps the deepest question cryonics raises. What is a human life worth? How much would you pay? What would you sacrifice? What would you risk for even a small chance of continued existence? The cryonics patients answered with specific numbers: $200,000, their life savings, their family's inheritance. They valued the possibility of revival that highly, judged their potential future existence worth that price. For people who reject cryonics, the implicit answer is different. They value other things more: legacy through children and work, acceptance and peace, resources used for the living rather than gambles on the dead, dignity in death, rituals that have meaning within their cultural or religious framework. These values aren't wrong, any more than the cryonics patients' values are wrong. They're different answers to the same impossible question of what matters when everything ends. What cryonics ultimately reveals is that we're still figuring out how to die. Despite hundreds of thousands of years of human experience with mortality, despite philosophy and religion and art all grappling with death, we haven't reached consensus. We haven't found the one right way to face the end. Some accept, some rage, some seek comfort in afterlife beliefs, some place hope in technology, and some, 500 so far, freeze themselves at minus 196 degrees Celsius and wait. The waiting is perhaps the most human part of all. Humans are waiting creatures. We wait for spring after winter. We wait for children to grow. We wait for healing after injury. We wait for answers to questions we cannot yet solve. The cryonics patients are waiting on a scale that dwarfs typical human patience. But the impulse is the same: the refusal to conclude, to close the book, to accept that the story is over. The insistence that maybe, possibly, one more chapter might come. This hope might be foolish. The odds are very long. The science is uncertain. The institutional stability questionable. The whole enterprise might be remembered as a strange historical curiosity, a footnote about what people believed before we truly understood consciousness and death. Or it might be remembered as the beginning of something profound, the first awkward steps toward defeating mortality, the moment when humans stopped accepting death as inevitable and started treating it as negotiable. We cannot know yet. The question remains open. The 500 wait in their cold suspension, while time answers slowly, decade by decade, century by century. Technology advances, or it doesn't. Organizations persist, or they fail. Revival becomes possible, or it remains fantasy. The frozen rest in darkness and cold in time, their gamble neither won nor lost, suspended between existence and extinction, between hope and oblivion, between the human past that always died and the human future that might, just possibly, choose to live forever. And perhaps that's the final truth cryonics teaches us, that we don't actually know where the limits are, that what seems impossible today might be routine tomorrow, that death, which has seemed absolute since consciousness first emerged, might be the next limit humanity learns to transcend, or might not, might remain the final wall, the ultimate boundary, the one impossibility that stays impossible no matter how much we wish otherwise. The 500 people in cryonic suspension live, if that's the right word, in the space of that uncertainty. They bet on possibility. They refused certainty. They chose the question over the answer. And now they wait, frozen at the edge of everything we know about life and death, waiting for the universe to reveal whether their extraordinary gamble was vision or folly, courage or delusion, the beginning of humanity's victory over death, or simply another way of dying, stranger than most, but no more successful. The cold holds, the nitrogen boils, the future unfolds, and the frozen wait, patient beyond patience, hoping beyond hope, suspended in the longest night, dreaming of an impossible dawn.